Your translator is lying. Black bartender stops the Korean Mafia boss. Before the ambush, a lie told in a foreign tongue is a blade hidden inside a bouquet. Beautiful to the eye, deadly to the one who reaches in. In the hushed, gilded warmth of the Polaris suite, where the chandeliers burned low and the mahogany table held enough zeros to reshape skylines, a deal worth $3 billion was being quietly dismembered. Not with shouting, not with threats, with something far more elegant, far more surgical. A word, then another, then the careful substitution of a third. Betty Maciel heard it the way a surgeon hears an irregular heartbeat. Not loudly, but with absolute bone-cold certainty. She moved between the seated men the way water moves around stone, present without pressure, necessary without announcement. And her black vest was pressed to perfection over her white collared shirt, her hair wound into a tight, unforgiving bun at the nape of her neck. To every man in that room, she was furniture with a pulse, a hand that poured, a face that smiled at the precise moment it was expected to. She had spent 2 years perfecting that particular kind of disappearance. 2 years of reducing herself to service, to silence, to the clean, forgiving anonymity of someone no one looks at twice. She had told herself it was survival. Tonight, standing 3 feet from the edge of something catastrophic, she was no longer sure survival was enough. At the head of the table sat Ryu Jum. She had served him twice already tonight and had clocked him in the way she used to clock everyone who sat across a negotiating table from her, completely and without mercy. Yeah, he was not what the Americans had assumed he was, and that misreading would cost them if the right person didn't intervene. His white dress shirt was open at the collar. Not carelessly, but deliberately, the way powerful men dress when they want you to mistake comfort for weakness. Dark ink climbed the edges of his neck and disappeared beneath the fabric, a history written on skin rather than paper. He held a pen loosely between 2 fingers as he reviewed the document spread before him, and his stillness was the specific stillness of a man who does not need to move to be dangerous. Beside him, in a dark suit slashed with a blood-red tie, sat his closest advisor. Across the table, the 2 Americans leaned back in their chairs with the loose confidence of men who believed this negotiation had already ended in their favor. Between them all stood Julian. Julian, with his sharp jaw and his tailored pocket square, and his voice that poured over the room like warm oil on cold water. Julian, who had been recruited, she now understood, not to translate, but to transform. Every sentence that left Ryu Jum's mouth, Julian smoothed down, softened, reshaped, and every sentence the Americans offered in return, Julian handed back with the edges sharpened into something that read like surrender on Ryu Jum's side. Betty caught the first manipulation the way you catch the smell of smoke before you see the fire. The territorial licensing clause, the geographic boundary provision that formed the skeleton of the entire agreement, rendered in Julian's honey-smooth Korean not as the non-negotiable parameter Ryu Jum had stated, but as an openness to further discussion. A firm line redrawn as a suggestion, a boundary dissolved into an invitation. Her hand did not shake. She set a glass of still water beside the American on the right and stepped back without betraying a single degree of the cold, clarifying fury gathering behind her eyes. Beneath the white cotton pressed flat against her sternum, her heart had begun its low, urgent percussion. The rhythm she remembered from every boardroom she had ever walked into, knowing the room was already set against someone. The rhythm that her father's voice used to calm, back when he was still alive to speak. Integrity, he had told her once, is the only load-bearing wall in any structure worth building. Pull it out, and everything falls. She watched Julian smile as he delivered the next carefully engineered mistranslation. She watched Ryu Jum's pen hover, just briefly, above the page. She told herself this was not her table, not her deal, not her destruction to stop. She had already lost everything once stepping into a room where the architects of ruin had more power than she did, and she had spent 2 quiet, invisible years paying for that decision with her freedom, her name, and her father's legacy. She told herself to refill the water glasses and walk away. Her feet did not move. Subscribe to see how this unfolds. And comment where you're watching from. I would love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is going. The Polaris suite had its own atmosphere, distinct from the rest of the restaurant, the way an operating theater is distinct from the lobby that leads to it. Same building, entirely different stakes. The chandeliers here burned at a lower register, their light warm and amber, designed to flatter rather than illuminate. The mahogany table ran the length of the room like a dark river, and the leather chairs around it held men who were accustomed to rooms exactly like this one. Rooms where enormous things were decided quietly, where the most dangerous sentences were delivered in the most pleasant tones. Betty had worked the Polaris suite 14 times in 2 years. She knew its rhythms the way she once knew the rhythms of arbitration chambers in Geneva and Singapore and Seoul. The particular way powerful men leaned back when they felt they were winning. The particular stillness that fell over a room when something irrevocable was about to happen. She had learned to carry that knowledge without showing it. Tonight, she carried it the way she carried the bottle. Steady grip, neutral expression, nothing in her posture to suggest she was listening to a single syllable of anything being said. She was listening to every syllable. Julian was mid-sentence when she crossed from the service station to the far end of the table, her movements unhurried and calibrated, the practiced glide of someone who had long ago learned to make herself peripheral. He was translating a response from Ryu Jum, something about territorial licensing rights, the geographic boundary clauses that formed the skeleton of the entire agreement. Betty refilled the water glass of the American on the left without looking at him. Her Korean was not textbook Korean, not the clean academic fluency of a language course. And it was the working Korean of a woman who had spent 4 years in Seoul negotiating infrastructure contracts beside people who expected her to miss things, and who had made it her quiet, private mission to miss nothing. What Julian rendered in English as Mr. Ryu is open to revisiting the regional parameters was not what Ryu Jum had said. What Ryu Jum had said, precisely and without ambiguity, was that the regional parameters were non-negotiable and had been non-negotiable since the preliminary term sheet. Betty set the water pitcher down on the service tray without a sound. Julian smiled at the Americans as he finished, that smooth, practiced smile of a man entirely at home inside his own deception. One of the Americans, the one with silver cufflinks and the unhurried posture of a man who considered himself the smartest in every room he entered, made a small note on the pad beside his hand. A note that meant, concession obtained. Across the table, Ryu Jum's expression did not change. He sat the way a great structure sits, still impassive, giving nothing away. His advisor, slightly behind his right shoulder, was equally unreadable. Betty moved back toward the service station. The second manipulation came 12 minutes later. She caught it mid-pour, a glass of still water threading clear into a crystal tumbler, her hand perfectly steady, while something inside her chest went very quiet and very cold. Julian was translating a question about penalty clauses, the teeth of the agreement, on the part that determined what happened when someone failed to perform, and he rendered Ryu Jum's firm, detailed stipulations as something vague, something that gestured at consequences without committing to them. A liability clause that should have been a wall became, in Julian's hands, a curtain. Something that looked like a boundary, but moved the moment anyone pushed it. The American with the cufflinks smiled. Betty finished the pour, placed the glass at a precise position, turned away from the table without haste. Her father had built bridges, not metaphorically, literally, physically, with concrete and steel cable and the kind of patient, exacting attention to structural integrity that he considered not a professional obligation, but a moral one. Maciel had designed load-bearing structures in 4 countries, and he had explained his philosophy to Betty the way most fathers explain religion: early, repeatedly, and with the full expectation that she would carry it past his death. Every structure, he had told her once, when she was 9 years old, and watching him review blueprints spread across their kitchen table, is only as strong as its weakest joint. You can have the most beautiful design in the world. You can have the best materials, the best engineers, the most money. But if someone put a weak joint in the foundation and nobody caught it, the whole thing comes down. He had looked at her then with the specific gravity of a man passing something important between generations. Your job, wherever you go, is to find the weak joint before it fails. She had built a career on that principle. 12 years in international arbitration, on working the fault lines between corporations and governments and sovereign wealth funds, finding the weak points in agreements before they became catastrophes. She had been good at it, not adequate, not competent, but genuinely, unusually gifted in the way that makes certain people dangerous to the organizations that would prefer their deals to fail cleanly and quietly. Which was, she now understood, precisely why Omnicorp had come for her. Not because she had done something wrong, because she had been too good at finding what they needed to stay hidden. The thought of her father tightened something behind her sternum as she moved back toward the service corridor. His name had been in the settlement documents, the ones that sealed her professional fate and buried the arbitration firm they had built together under a landslide of fraudulent liability claims. He had not survived the aftermath. The official record said heart failure. Betty knew what it actually was. She had been carrying that knowledge for 2 years, in the same careful, invisible way she carried everything else. Julian was a weak joint. She recognized him with a fluency that went beyond language, recognized the craft of what he was doing, the specific engineering of a sabotage designed to look like facilitation. He wasn't improvising. The substitutions were too precise, too consistent, each one a small alteration that would only reveal its full damage when the agreement was already signed and someone tried to enforce it. And this was trained work, practiced work, the kind of work that left no fingerprints because it required nothing more incriminating than a translated sentence. She had seen this blueprint before. She had watched it demolish everything she had ever built. The service corridor was narrow and fluorescent, and the only place in the Polaris suite's orbit where Betty could breathe without an audience. She stood beside the wine rack with the next bottle already in her hand, the 1982 Chateau Margaux, requested by the table at the start of the evening and held back until the appropriate moment, and she let herself, for exactly 30 seconds, be entirely honest with herself about what was happening. She had 2 choices. She had always had 2 choices, in every room where she had ever been the only person who understood what was actually being said. The first was the one she had chosen 2 years ago, when she saw the early signs of Omnicorp's campaign against her father's firm and calculated, incorrectly, that silence was the safer architecture. She had stayed invisible. She had protected herself. She had watched the structure fall anyway and had spent every day since living in the rubble, wearing someone else's uniform, answering to a name tag that felt like a costume. The second choice was the one her father had raised her to make. She turned the Margaux in her hands. 1982. A bottle worth more than her monthly salary, chosen for this table because men like the ones seated in the Polaris suite understood value in the specific language of rarity, in things that could not be replicated, could not be forged, could not be rendered as something other than what they were. There was a particular irony in using it as cover. She almost smiled. Across every scenario she ran in the next 30 seconds, the calculus kept returning the same result. Ryu Jum was about to sign a document that would give the Americans everything they wanted at a cost he had explicitly refused to accept, and he had no way of knowing that the man translating for him had rewritten the terms of the agreement in the space between one language and another. He was walking into a trap built from the trust he had placed in a bridge that had already been quietly compromised. And Betty Maciel, former senior associate in international arbitration, architect's daughter, 2-year ghost, was the only person in the building who could see it. The fluorescent light buzzed once above her head. She picked up the Margot and walked back through the door. The approach had to be seamless. That was the only constraint that mattered. Not because she was afraid of Julian noticing, though she was, and not because she was afraid of what the Americans would do if the interruption was obvious, though that fear was also present and accounted for. The constraint was about Ryu Jum himself. A man like that, in a room like this, with the stakes at the precise level they were at, he would not respond well to an obvious intervention. He would not respond well to anything that looked like a disruption or a scene, or a bartender making herself the center of attention. What she needed was a single private moment inside the choreography of service. Something that looked exactly like what it was supposed to look like, or right up until the second it became something else entirely. She crossed to the head of the table the way she had crossed to it 3 times already tonight. Same pace, same posture, same slight forward angle of the tray. Julian was speaking. The Americans had asked a follow-up question about the penalty clause, pressing the opening he had manufactured for them, and Julian was mid-translation, his smooth voice filling the space between the 2 sides of the table with the precise confidence of a man who had done this many times before. Ryu Jum was listening, his gaze on Julian, his pen resting against the document. Betty arrived at Ryu Jum's right. She placed the tray down at the service position, lifted the Margot with both hands in the formal 2-handed pour that the room's register demanded, and let the wine thread dark and slow into the crystal. And in the specific narrow window of time, when the pour gave her a reason to be leaning close, when the angle of service created a natural, unremarkable intimacy between the woman pouring and the man receiving, she turned her face the precise few degrees required, and in Korean, in a register so low it existed only in the 6 inches between her lips and his ear, she said it. Beonyo gaga geojismalil hagoisoyo. Your translator is lying. She straightened. She completed the pour. She set the bottle at the correct angle and stepped back into the peripheral zone of service without a single variation in her expression or her pace. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Ryu Jum set his pen down. It was the quality of his stillness that changed first. His composure had always been present, but this was different. Not the patience of a man waiting for a process to conclude, but the focused, compressed quiet of a man who has just received intelligence and is rapidly recalibrating the entire landscape around him. His advisor noticed it first. Betty saw the advisor's gaze tick to Ryu Jum's face, and then go very still itself. Julian was still speaking. He hadn't stopped, hadn't noticed anything. Why would he? The bartender had poured the wine. The bartender had stepped back. The transaction was complete and invisible, the way it was always complete and invisible, and Julian continued to construct his elegant, devastating translation with the fluid confidence of a craftsman who believes he is working without witnesses. Ryu Jum let him finish. Then he looked, for the first time directly and without diplomatic softening, at the 2 Americans across the table. When he spoke, he did not speak Korean. He spoke English, clear, precise, unaccented English, with the particular deliberate weight of a man who has been fluent for years and has chosen, until this exact moment, to let other people believe otherwise. I would like, he said, with a calm that was far more unsettling than anger would have been, for someone to explain to me why the penalty clause in the document in front of me describes consequences that are materially different from the terms I specified in writing, in English, 6 weeks ago. The silence that followed was the specific silence of a room in which a hidden fracture has just become visible. The American with the cufflinks stopped smiling. The other American put his water glass down very carefully, as though he was suddenly concerned about what his hands might do otherwise. Julian's face did not collapse. He was too practiced for that. But something in the arrangement of his features shifted, almost imperceptibly. the micro-adjustment of a man rapidly recalculating a situation that has just turned in a direction he did not plan for. "Mr. Ryu," Julian began, his voice carrying the first faint trace of effort it had shown all evening. "I believe there may be a translation discrepancy that I can—" "You translated my non-negotiable regional parameters as an openness to revision," Ryujum said. He had not raised his voice. He had not needed to. "You translated my specific liability stipulations as a general preference, and you have been doing this, I now understand, since the beginning of this evening." He paused. "I have been listening to both versions of this conversation. I have been waiting to understand why they were different." He turned his head, just slightly, toward the space where Betty stood at the edge of the room. He did not look directly at her, not yet, but the slight angle of acknowledgement was unmistakable to anyone paying the right kind of attention. "Now I understand." The American with the cufflinks had gone very still in the specific way of a man who is deciding, at speed, whether what is happening can still be managed or whether the situation has moved entirely beyond his control. The answer, available to everyone in the room, except possibly the man still running the calculation, was clearly the latter. Julian opened his mouth once more. Ryujum looked at him the way a structural engineer looks at a failed joint, not with surprise, not with rage, but with the cold, complete assessment of a man cataloging the damage and determining what comes next. "You should," Ryujum said, in Korean now, with the courtesy of a man who no longer needs to pretend the bridge between them is intact, "be very quiet." Julian closed his mouth. The chandeliers burned low over the mahogany table. The Margot sat dark and still in its crystal, and Betty Maciel stood at the edge of the room in her black vest and her white shirt, her hands at her sides, her expression composed and unreadable, no longer entirely invisible, and not yet entirely anything else, standing precisely at the threshold between the ghost she had been and the woman she was about to remember how to be. You just watched a ghost become dangerous. If Betty and Ryujum have your full attention, subscribe and ring that bell, because the next chapter is where everything they built gets tested. Drop a comment. Are you Team Betty or Team Ryujum? One whisper changed everything tonight. What happens when Omnicorp whispers back? Don't miss it. Nobody moved for a long moment. The room held the particular suspended quality of a held breath. Everything present, nothing yet resolved, the outcome balanced on the edge of what happened next. Then Ryujum turned to his advisor and said 4 words in Korean that Betty understood immediately and completely. The advisor stood without urgency, without theater, with the smooth efficiency of a man who had been prepared for exactly this contingency, and he crossed to the door and opened it. 2 men appeared in the doorway, men who had been stationed somewhere just outside, in that invisible perimeter that powerful people always maintain around themselves in rooms like this one. They were not loud. They were not dramatic. They simply entered and positioned themselves at Julian's shoulders with the quiet, immovable certainty of architecture. Julian looked at the 2 Americans. The Americans looked at the table. Nobody looked at Julian. He stood slowly, with whatever shreds of composure remained available to him, and straightened his pocket square with a gesture so automatic it was almost sad, the reflex of a man whose performance had just ended reaching for the costume anyway. He did not speak. There was nothing left in the room for his voice to accomplish. The men at his shoulders were not a request. He walked to the door between them with his chin at a controlled angle, and the door closed behind all 3 of them with a sound so soft it was almost inaudible, a full stop delivered in a whisper. What remained in the room after Julian's departure was a specific kind of silence, not the silence of a pause, but the silence of a verdict. The Americans understood this. Betty could see it in the recalibration happening in real time across both of their faces, the rapid private audit of a situation that had shifted entirely beneath them. The one with the silver cufflinks, the one who had been making small, satisfied notes throughout the evening, placed both hands flat on the table in front of him with the careful deliberateness of a man disarming himself. His colleague, who had said less throughout the evening and now appeared deeply grateful for that particular economy, stared at a fixed point on the mahogany surface and said nothing at all. Ryu Jum did not press them. He did not need to. The exposure of the mechanism, the removal of the instrument, the sudden total visibility of what had been attempted in this room over the past 2 hours, all of it was doing the work without any further effort from him. He simply sat, his pen still resting beside the unsigned document, and allowed the Americans to spend a long, uncomfortable minute inside the full weight of what they had come here to do and how completely it had failed. Then he said, in English, with the measured neutrality of a man conducting an assessment rather than a confrontation, I will require new counsel to be present before any further discussion of this agreement takes place. I will also require a full written explanation of how Mr. Julian came to be positioned as my translator for this negotiation, including who recommended him and under what terms. He paused. Tonight's session is concluded. The American with the cufflinks opened his mouth once, then understood the specific futility of whatever he had been about to say, and closed it again. He gathered his notepad, the one with the small, satisfied annotations that no longer meant anything, and placed it inside his leather portfolio with the careful, mechanical movements of a man operating entirely on procedural instinct, because every higher function had temporarily gone offline. His colleague was already standing. They left without the easy confidence with which they had arrived. The room felt different with them gone. Cleaner somehow, the way a space feels after something that had been contaminating the air is finally removed. The advisor closed the door behind them and returned to his position. The two of them remained at the table, and the room held a different quality of stillness now. Not the taut, loaded stillness of a negotiation in progress, but something more deliberate, more directed, like the quiet of a room in which a question is about to be asked and both parties understand that the answer will matter. Betty was still standing at the edge of the room. She had not moved, had not permitted herself the luxury of movement, since the moment she had stepped back from the pour. Her tray was in her hands. The Margot sat on the table where she had left it, 3/4 full, the wine catching the chandelier light in the glass, with an indifference to everything that had just occurred that she found, in some distant register, darkly funny. Her face was composed. Every professional instinct she had spent 2 years cultivating in this uniform told her that the appropriate next action was to collect the tray, return to the service station, and allow the room's business to conclude without her presence. She did not move. Ryu Jum turned and looked at her directly for the first time. It was not an aggressive look. It was not the look of a man assessing a threat or cataloging a liability. It was the look of a man who had just received something of significant value from a completely unexpected source and was now engaged in the serious business of understanding exactly what it was and where it had come from. His gaze was steady and unhurried, and it carried the specific quality of attention that Betty associated with people who had learned, by necessity or by nature, that the most important information in any room was usually located in the place nobody had thought to look. "Sit down," he said. Not unkindly. Not as a question. Betty looked at the chair across from him, the chair that the American with the cufflinks had vacated, and felt something shift in the geography of the moment. Sitting would mean something. Sitting would be a different kind of threshold than the one she had already crossed when she had leaned in and whispered the truth into the ear of a man she did not know in a room where the cost of being noticed was potentially ruinous. She had already crossed that threshold. What was on the other side of this one was less clear. She set her tray on the service station. She sat down. "Who are you?" Ryu Jum asked. It was a simple question. It was also, in the specific context of this room and this moment, the most complicated question anyone had asked Betty Maciel in 2 years. She had spent 2 years making certain nobody asked it, making herself so peripheral, so functionally invisible, so thoroughly reduced to the function of her uniform that the question never arose. She had a name tag. She had a job title. She had a carefully maintained blankness about her history that most people interpreted as privacy and left alone. Ryu Jum was not most people. She looked at him across the mahogany table. This man with his dark tattoos and his deceptive stillness and his perfect English that he had held in reserve like a weapon he hadn't needed to use until tonight. And she made a decision that felt less like a choice and more like the removal of something she had been holding in place through sustained, exhausting effort for a very long time. "My name is Betty Maciel," she said. "Until 2 years ago, I was a senior associate in international arbitration. I specialized in cross-border infrastructure agreements and corporate governance disputes. I worked primarily in Asia and West Africa, with a secondary focus on Southeast Asian markets." She paused. "Before that, I worked at my father's firm, Emmanuel Maciel Associates. We handled structural and contractual work in 4 countries over 22 years. She said it cleanly, without editorializing, the way she had once presented opening statements, factual, precise, the emotional content present, but contained within the architecture of the language rather than spilling over its edges. Omnicorp had us removed. The word removed sat on the table between them. She had chosen it deliberately, not destroyed, not ruined, though both were accurate, but removed, because it was the coldest word available, and the cold ones were the ones that held their shape longest under pressure. Ryu Jum did not react with the surprise she had half expected. He looked at her with the same steady, unreadable attention he had maintained since asking the question, and she understood from the quality of his listening that he was not hearing this as a bartender's personal tragedy. He was hearing it as information. He was filing it in whatever architecture of understanding he was building around the events of this evening, measuring it against things he already knew, finding the connections. "How did it happen?" he asked. She had not told this story, the full story, not the redacted version, not the one she recited to herself at 3 a.m. when sleep refused to come, to anyone in 2 years. She had kept it the way you keep a case file on a building you no longer have jurisdiction over, accurate, thorough, and entirely private. But she told it now. Or she told it across a mahogany table in a room still faintly warm with the aftermath of an ambush she had interrupted, to a man who had every reason to understand what it meant when someone with the right knowledge was strategically positioned to cause damage from the inside. She told him about the Hargreaves contract, the infrastructure arbitration that had been her firm's largest and most complex engagement, a $400 million dispute between a West African government and a consortium of development banks that had taken 3 years to approach resolution. She told him about the liability documentation that had been altered, subtly, precisely, in the specific way that Julian had altered translations tonight, with the fingerprints filed off and the mechanism invisible to anyone who hadn't spent years learning to find the cracks. She told him about her father's co-signatory status on the documents that were later presented as fraudulent, and about how the framing had been constructed with the care of people who understood that the most effective traps are the ones that look like accidents. She told him about the settlement she had been pressured to sign under threat of criminal referral, a settlement that had sealed the record, buried the firm, and left her father's name attached to a professional failure he had spent his entire career making impossible. She told him about the 18 months that followed, in which Emmanuel Maciel's health had declined with the specific, unsteady trajectory of a man who has had the thing that held him upright removed from beneath him. She told him about the morning she had come to understand that grief and structural collapse are not metaphors for each other, but the same thing, dressed differently. She told him all of it in the same steady, measured register she had maintained from the beginning. When she finished, the room was very quiet. Ryu Jum's advisor had not moved from his position. Somewhere in the building beyond the suite's heavy door, the restaurant continued its ordinary evening. The low music, the movement of other staff, the distant percussion of a kitchen in full operation. It all seemed very far away. Omnicorp, Rujum said. The word came out of him with a weight that suggested it was not, for him, an unfamiliar one. Yes, Betty said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said something to his advisor in Korean. 4 words, a name she didn't recognize, and a number. The advisor moved to the far corner of the room and made a call. Betty watched this without comment, and the part of her that had spent 2 years reading rooms told her that something had just been set in motion, though she could not yet see its shape. The call lasted less than 3 minutes. The advisor returned to the table and placed a tablet in front of Ryu Jum, who reviewed what was on the screen with the rapid, practiced attention of a man accustomed to processing dense information quickly. He looked up once, briefly, at Betty, with an expression she could not entirely read. Then he turned the tablet around and placed it in front of her. What she was looking at was a dossier. Not a small one. It ran, she scrolled slowly, and then faster, to dozens of pages, and it was organized with a precision that told her immediately it had not been assembled tonight, had not been assembled in response to anything she had said. It had already existed. It had been built by people who were good at this, over what must have been a significant amount of time, and it contained things she had never seen, internal Omnicorp communications that should have been sealed under the settlement, financial transfer records that traced the movement of funds through 3 shell companies to the legal team that had prosecuted her, and a detailed account of the altered Hargreaves documentation that named, with specificity and supporting evidence, the 2 Omnicorp operatives who had made the alterations. She looked up from the screen. These documents were sealed under the settlement agreement. Yes, Ryujum said. The seal applies to you. It does not apply to people who were never party to the agreement and who obtained copies through means that will not be discussed in this room. He said it without apology and without elaboration, the way a man states a fact that answers the question without inviting further inquiry. She accepted this, the way she accepted most things that were true and beyond her immediate control, and continued reading. Her father's name appeared on page 11 in a section that laid out, with the terrible clarity of documentary evidence, the full picture of what had been done to him and why and by whom. She read that section twice. Her hands, resting flat on the table on either side of the tablet, did not shake. The thing happening behind her sternum was large and complicated, and she set it aside with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had learned to feel things on a schedule she controlled. She looked up. You already knew, she said. It was not an accusation. It was an observation, made with the neutral precision of someone delivering a finding. We knew some of it, Ryujum said. We knew Omnicorp had a pattern. We knew the pattern involved the selective removal of people whose competence represented a specific kind of threat to their operations. We did not know your name was part of it until tonight. He paused. We have been building this file for 14 months. Why? Betty asked. What is Omnicorp to you? The answer came not in words, but in the quality of the silence that preceded them. The specific silence of a man deciding how much of a true thing to say to someone he has known for less than an evening and has already, by the evidence of tonight, substantial reason to trust. She waited. She had learned, in 12 years of arbitration, that the spaces between words were often where the most important information lived. 3 years ago, Ryujum said, a negotiation similar to tonight's was conducted on my behalf by a translator I had been given every reason to trust. The agreement that resulted from that negotiation contained terms I had not agreed to. I did not discover this until the contract was already in effect. He said this with the flat and contained precision of a man reporting a failure he has spent 3 years analyzing. By the time I understood what had happened, the damage was significant. The translator, when located, could not be connected to anyone through any channel that would hold in a legal proceeding. The people behind him were very careful. He looked at her steadily. The people behind him were Omnicorp. Betty absorbed this. She thought about the pattern. about what it meant that the same mechanism she had watched Julian operate tonight had been deployed before, against this man, in a different room, with a different set of stakes. She thought about what it meant that she had recognized the mechanism immediately, that her recognition had been so instant and so certain it had felt less like analysis and more like memory. She thought about her father's blueprint spread across the kitchen table, and the thing he had told her about weak joints and the structures they bring down. "How many times," she said slowly, "has this happened? Not just to you. How many negotiations? How many agreements?" Ryujum looked at her with the steady regard of a man watching someone arrive at a conclusion he has been living with for a long time. "That," he said, "is precisely the right question." The dossier's final section, the one she had not yet read when Ryujum's words sent her back to the tablet with a specific new focus, was not about her. It was not about Ryujum. It was a network map, a connected architecture of translators, legal intermediaries, contract reviewers, and internal advisors, placed inside major international negotiations over a period of 11 years, across 14 countries, in industries ranging from infrastructure to pharmaceutical licensing to sovereign energy contracts. Each node in the network was a person. Each person had been positioned in the specific way Julian had been positioned tonight, inside a negotiation where their particular linguistic or legal access gave them reach to the exact pressure points of an agreement. Each placement had served the same purpose. Each placement had served Marcus Thorne. Near the bottom of the map, she found it. Julian's name, cross-referenced with a shell consultancy registered in Delaware, traceable through 2 intermediary payments back to an Omnicorp subsidiary. He had not been improvising in the Polaris suite. He had been deployed. A placed asset, activated for this specific negotiation, doing precisely what he had been trained and paid to do. The name at the center of the map she had known for 2 years, had known it the way you know the name of the architect of something that has destroyed you. But she had known it in isolation, as the face of a single act of targeted destruction. What the dossier showed her was something else entirely. Marcus Thorne was not a man who had ruined her. Marcus Thorne was a man who ruined things systematically, professionally, at scale, who had built over 11 years an invisible infrastructure of sabotage that operated inside legitimate business processes, that left no fingerprints because it required no illegal tools, only people, placed carefully, in the right rooms. She had not been a casualty of his operation. She had been a threat to it, and her father's firm had been positioned, by geography, by specialization, by the specific combination of linguistic fluency and contractual expertise that Emmanuel Maciel had spent 22 years building, directly in the path of several of Omnicorp's most valuable ongoing operations. Not because Betty had discovered anything, simply because she was good enough that discovery was, in Marcus Thorne's assessment, a matter of time. He had removed her before she could find him. He had been right to be afraid. As for the 2 Americans who had sat across the mahogany table that evening, they did not escape the dossier's reach either. Their names appeared in a footnote in the final pages. Executives with documented ties to 2 of the shell entities used to funnel payments to Thorne's network of placed assets. Where within 3 weeks of the Polaris suite meeting, Ryujum's legal team had forwarded the relevant financial records to 2 separate regulatory bodies on 2 continents. The men with their leather portfolios and easy conference room confidence would spend the following year in the considerably less comfortable atmosphere of formal investigation. Betty set the tablet down. The chandeliers burned in the amber register above the mahogany table. The Margot sat in its crystal, dark and still and entirely indifferent. Betty Maciel sat in a chair that had been occupied an hour ago by a man who had come into this room with the casual confidence of someone who had won before he arrived, and she felt something shift inside her. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with the quiet, irreversible certainty of a decision that has finally been made after a very long time of not making it. The 2 years of invisibility and practiced disappearance and careful deliberate smallness were on one side of this moment. The woman her father had raised was on the other side of it, waiting with the patient solidity of something that had never actually left, only been built around until it couldn't move. She looked at Ryujum. "You need someone who can identify this mechanism in real time," she said. "In any language, in any room, before the documents are signed." It was not a question. She was reading the shape of the situation the way she had always read her cases, from the foundation up, finding what was actually holding the weight. "You've been building the dossier. You have the evidence of the pattern. But evidence of past sabotage doesn't protect future negotiations. You need someone inside the room who can hear what's actually being said." Ryujum said nothing. He was listening with the full, focused attention he brought to everything, and she understood that the silence was not absence but presence, that he was giving her the space to finish the thing she was saying without interrupting it. "The people Marcus Thorne places in these rooms are trained," she continued. "They're not amateurs making mistakes. Julian tonight was skilled, genuinely skilled. What he did would not have been detectable by anyone without the specific combination of linguistic fluency and contractual knowledge required to identify the alterations as alterations rather than translation variants." She paused. "I have that combination. I have had it for 12 years. It is, as it turns out, the reason I was targeted in the first place." She said this last part without bitterness. Not because the bitterness was absent, but because it had long ago been refined into something harder and more useful. "You could use it." Ryujum looked at her for a long, steady moment. Then something happened at the edges of his expression. Not quite a smile, but the structural precondition of one. A slight easing of the controlled stillness that had characterized his face all evening, as though something he had been holding in careful reserve had been permitted, briefly, to relax. "I had already decided that," he said. "I was waiting to see if you had." She did not accept immediately. That would not have been honest. Not to him, not to herself. The woman who had walked into the Polaris suite that evening had been 2 years deep into an architecture of invisibility that did not dismantle itself in a single conversation, however consequential. She asked for time. He gave it without condition or urgency, which she noted and filed in the place where she kept assessments of what people were made of. She spent 3 days in her apartment with the dossier, a copy of which Ryujum's advisor had transferred to her encrypted drive before she left the restaurant that night, reading it with the methodical thoroughness she had once brought to the most complex cases of her career. She read it not as a record of damage, but as a blueprint for prevention. She made notes in the margins of her own copy. She cross-referenced the timeline against the timeline of her own career, finding the moments of intersection she had never been able to identify before, the moments where Omnicorp's shadow had touched her work years before she knew the name, watching, assessing, waiting. On the 4th day, she called the number the advisor had left with her. On the 6th day, she met with Ryujum again. Not in a restaurant, in an office, a clean spare room in a building she was escorted to, with the same quiet, efficient care that characterized everything in his operation. The conversation that followed lasted 4 hours, and it began the way all the most consequential conversations of her career had begun, with the honest statement of what each party needed and what each was prepared to offer. She asked him what he needed. He told her, with a specificity and directness she found deeply familiar, like a frequency she had been trained to hear. She told him what she was able to provide, and what she was not, and what the conditions of her involvement needed to be, and he listened to all of it with the same focused attention he had brought to every exchange they had had. When she was finished, he extended his hand across the table. She looked at it for a moment. She thought about her father at the kitchen table, blueprints spread wide, telling her that every structure is only as strong as its weakest joint. She thought about Julian's smooth voice rewriting the terms of a deal in the narrow invisible space between languages. She thought about the dossier, and the map at its center, and the name at the center of the map, and the 11 years of carefully engineered destruction that name represented. The careers ended, saw the agreements poisoned, the foundations quietly compromised in 100 gilded rooms where the person with the right ears to hear the damage hadn't been present. She thought about what it meant to be a bridge builder. Not the metaphor, the actual commitment, the decision to place yourself at the fault line between two things that need to meet and make yourself the point of connection. It required exposure. It required being visible, being present, being precisely in the place where the pressure was greatest. It could not be done from the periphery. It could not be done by a ghost. She shook his hand. The hardest morning was not the one in Seoul, 6 months later, when she stood at the head of a boardroom table with the Han River shining silver 43 floors below. The hardest morning was the one 3 days after the handshake, when she walked into the restaurant at 6:45 a.m., before the other staff arrived, hung her black vest on its hook for the last time, and left her name tag on the manager's desk with a note that said simply, "Thank you. I have to go back." She stood on the pavement outside for a moment in the early morning quiet, wearing her own clothes for the first time in what felt like years. No uniform, no name tag, no choreography of invisibility. Just Betty Maciel, in a city that had never known her real name, about to step back into a life that had been waiting with more patience than she deserved. She walked to the corner. She flagged a cab. She did not look back. 6 months later, Betty Maciel stood in a boardroom in Seoul, on the 43rd floor of a building with a view of the Han River, shining like hammered silver in the afternoon light. She was wearing a dark blazer over a silk blouse, her hair down around her shoulders for the first time in 2 years, and she was standing at the head of the table because the head of the table was where the work required her to be. Across from her sat the representatives of a sovereign infrastructure fund. 4 people, 2 translators, a legal team. On her side sat Ryu Jum's team, and Ryu Jum himself, and the woman he had appointed 6 months ago as head of international negotiations, a former senior associate in international arbitration, a structural engineer's daughter, a person who had spent 2 years as a ghost and who understood, now, that ghosts are not defined by their invisibility, but by their unfinished work. She had unfinished work. She opened the meeting. The room listened. Drop a comment. Do you think Betty is everything she appears to be? Or is there a layer to her past we haven't uncovered yet? Like this video, if this forbidden alliance between a ghost and a mafia boss has you completely hooked. The next chapter drops soon. And trust me, you are not ready for what Omnicorp does when it realizes Betty Maciel is no longer hiding. See you in the next one, if she makes it out alive.